Tucked away in archives, attics, and sometimes even eBay listings are maps that once shaped how people saw the world, only to be forgotten with time. In the Library of Lost Maps, Professor James Cheshire breathes new life into these overlooked treasures, revealing the stories they still have to tell. Today, we're joined by James to explore the surprising histories behind these maps, why they matter, and what they reveal about the people and places that created them. Let's open the library and begin our journey. Welcome back to Geographical Thinking. I'm Michelle Brake, and I'll be your guide as we explore ideas, stories, and conversations through the lens of geography. Thank you for joining me today, James, and welcome to Geographical Thinking. How is your summer going into fall going?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Summer's been, quiet, but it's sort of a period of quiet anticipation, I guess. So I finished the book in mid-spring and then it went to print in July. So this is I've been in the period of just waiting to see how the finished copies turned out and then seeing how people react to it when they can pick it up in the bookstores.
Okay, so calm before the pleasant welcome storm
I
for the
hope so.
fall.
Yeah, exactly right.
Awesome. Well, before we dive into the world of lost maps, can you start by introducing yourself, maybe telling us a little bit about what you do and what drew you to the world of cartography?
Yeah, sure. I am a professor of geographic information and cartography in the Department of Geography at University College London. And I'm also the inaugural director of this thing called the Social Data Institute. And so I have a range of interests around spatial data, mapping, and population data sets as well. So understanding how, new forms of data about people can tell us something interesting about society and so on. So that's kind of what I do for research, and that's where my funding, I guess, largely comes from. But then I kind of lead this slightly parallel life as well, where I'm interested in creating maps and data visualizations from some of the data sets I work with in my research. And kind of in the last few years, I've been pivoting more towards being almost like a historical geographer or historical cartographer and looking at some of these older maps. And the connection there between the two has always been, it's amazing to me how, ideas that were developed a century ago are still relevant today, in the way that we make our maps. So at times they feel like quite distant worlds I'm in, but actually there are some pretty interesting overlaps between them.
And I think, talking of interesting overlaps, something that you made me aware of that I wasn't beforehand is that University College London, the institution you're attached to, has a fascinating connection to Canada through Roger Tomlinson, who completed the first ever PhD in GIS, and from there going on to develop the world's first computerized GIS for the Canadian government. With that connection in mind, I'm wondering, as Britain's only professor of geographic information and cartography, how do you see your work at UCL building on that legacy, and what does that UCL Canada connection mean to you?
Yeah, well, UCL is actually an extraordinary place, and it's actually not just UCL itself. UCL is in a neighbourhood in London called Bloomsbury, and there's actually a number of other universities around there too, where there's a real kind of history of mapping and map making that actually predates Tomlinson. I mean, it goes back to the Victorian era and some pioneering cartographers who are associated with the founding of UCL and some of the universities in that neighborhood. They understood that maps were really important as ways to kind of educate people. And UCL was the first university in the UK to appoint a professor in geography. He didn't hang around that long, but and then there was a bit of a gap. But then the next guys came along in the 1920s, and that's really where things started to build in terms of the department and its reputation. And so Roger Tomlinson's arrival in the 1970s was through speaking to someone at a conference and understanding that there was some interest in automated mapping and map making and some of that pioneering work. And what's so extraordinary is the person who supervised Tomlinson's PhD, Professor Peter Wood, he's actually still around. So he's an emeritus professor in our department, and I know him really well. So actually, there's a direct connection there. Peter's been kind of a mentor to me and others. And then since, the pioneering work of Tomlinson in the 70s, we've actually had lots of, people coming through, always looking to kind of develop mapping and indeed, UCL, it was a UCL student who founded OpenStreetMap, for example, and actually a lot of the OpenStreetMap data for a time was actually hosted on UCL servers. So it's this funny place, really, where a lot of the pioneering work, particularly in the UK, but also with kind of global implications, just sort of gravitated around UCL. So I'm part of that legacy, and it's something that I take pretty seriously, and I want to carry on and build and develop for the next however long we're around, because I think UCL is a special place for geospatial, and it's certainly the largest in the UK in terms of the community of people that are working with these kinds of technologies.
And it's interesting to hear how those connections and legacies have played a part over time in seeing the things that we know today and frequently work with and experience do play a larger role in our day-to-day lives. The OpenStreetMap one was a surprise for me. I know there's some mentions of it in various parts of the new book that we're going to talk about as well. But it's interesting to know all of these things come and have this long legacy to one institution. So congrats on being at the celebrity institution of GIS and mapping.
Yeah, well, I feel very fortunate, and I'm lucky that there are many names that pass through UCL. So my PhD advisor and still kind of close mentor is someone called Professor Paul Longley, who wrote kind of Geographic Information Systems and Science textbook with Mike Goodchild and David Rind and David Maguire and others. So there's a group there, and then people who are interested in cities will be familiar with Mike Batty and the group at the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. So there's few places where you can just kind of bump into these people and learn from them. So I'm very fortunate in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we dive into your new book, let's talk a little bit about your Atlas of the Invisible. It made data deeply human. I'm wondering, how did that shape your experience and your thinking for your next project?
So, interesting question. So, as I alluded to in my introduction, I mean, a lot of my kind of work is really about pioneering technology for data visualization, for mapping, for cartography, and for seeing how maps can offer a compelling window into this world of big data, and I guess now kind of a world of AI too. But it was always I was always aware that there was a kind of a history that you're building upon. So actually, every book that I've published previously. So I've done 3 kind of atlas type books with a designer named Oliver Uberti. One was on London. It's called London, the Information Capital. One was about animal movements. It's called Where the Animals Go. And then the book you referenced was Atlas of the Invisible. All 3 of those started with some historical examples of maps that helped kind of lay the foundations for what would then come in the book. So the London book was the John Snow pump example, for example, which again, is just a 10-minute walk from UCL in Bloomsbury. The animals book was about early examples of animal tracking and mapping for things like resource management and the whaling industry. For example, was actually an example where mapping was pioneered to help target where these Wales were. And now, of course, they have a legacy. Those maps have a legacy in conservation because they show us where the whales once were and how we might preserve areas of the ocean so that they might well return. And then in Atlas of the Invisible, the scope was really global, and it was making the case for how, exciting and new forms of data can help explain something about the world today. And the idea that everything is connected really originated in the 1800s with a guy named Alexander von Humboldt, who many people will be familiar with as this kind of pioneering naturalist and natural scientist and so on. And he developed these ideas about the world being this big connected system of systems. And the way he articulated that was through maps and actually creating or commissioning a really fantastic atlas from a German cartographer. And so that was really the inspiration. It was understanding how he used maps, which then allowed us to kind of say, well, can we replicate some of that thinking, some of those ideas with contemporary data sets? So that's always been the kind of starting point for me. It's, are there some interesting old examples where people have solved a problem we're looking to solve cartographically, or they've got interesting ideas they want to use maps for? Can we take inspiration from those, and then can we, create some really compelling maps from contemporary data using contemporary software and methods?
I think it's interesting that you bring up that connection of the historical maps that have provided this legacy of all the information that we build on today into the digital world that we're living in with map making. And this mirrors a lot of UCL's connection as well to the very beginnings of GIS and how maps and technology have always evolved together. In your new book, The Library of Lost Maps, looks back at maps that were once influential but later forgotten. Again, also similar to, but different from Tomlinson's story, where we see now kind of that flip of, instead of things being forgotten, the digital now comes into play that key role in our everyday life. And that gets acknowledged within the chapter Maps Go Digital of the book. With all of those things in mind, a lot of stuff, I'm wondering what inspired this particular project and what qualifies a map as lost? What do they reveal about that shifting role of cartography over time?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the answer relates back to UCL, and actually, it's a room. The map library that the book is based on is a room that Tomlinson would have been familiar with because it was an integral part of our department. And so, the context for this is that UCL Geography Department has its map library, and it's one of the few remaining map libraries in a university department in the UK. And the reason for that is many of these map libraries have been closed down, and the maps have been given away or disposed of or scattered to four corners of the university, to different libraries and so on. And that was the threat, and to a certain extent, that threat still remains hanging over the space that we have at UCL. And so, you referenced me as the kind of only professor of geographic information and cartography in the UK, and the cartography bit's the crucial one there. I felt that I had to be responsible for this room and to see if we could see what was in there and what we could do with it to try and secure its future. And that was it, really. It was just me starting to kind of go through the drawers in this space, and I didn't know what I was going to find. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with the stuff, that I was discovering. And my initial idea was maybe I can, maybe write a blog and pull out some favorites and things like that. But as I was going through these drawers, I was just pulling out maps that I just, could not believe we had, and people were not even sure. People didn't know that we had them, or they'd been forgotten about, and so that was what gave me the idea of saying, well, actually, I think some of these need more information researched about them. We've got many unanswered questions, like how did they come to be in the map library in the first place? Who created them? What was their purpose? And so that's what I set about doing. I just set about going through the room and seeing what I could find. And, I still can't tell you how many maps there are, but there'll be tens of, I think there's at least tens of thousands, 750 atlases, and over 250, big pull down wall charts. Later, I've only been able to kind of pull out a few. Well, the book features 100 from that total, so 100's still a pretty big number, but it's actually a small percentage of the overall total. So, yeah, it's been a fascinating project. I mean, in terms of what qualifies a map as being lost, there are some that were literally lost. So, for example, I found a copy of the first geological map of India that was created by an early investor and associate of UCL. There were roughly 30 known copies of this map to exist, and this was an unknown copy that we had and was actually in pretty good condition. So that was something that was a real find. And there's actually quite a lot of maps that have become lost because the generation of people that maybe understood what they were for, or were involved in their acquisition or their use, then that generation is no longer with us, and they never really passed that information on, particularly around some of the maps to do with the Second World War, in particular. And again, there's another Tomlinson link there because he was in the Royal Air Force. So those sorts of connections are now being lost, and so rediscovering the significance of these maps and atlases, I thought was important for us to do, just to understand, what the legacies of these objects were, but how they can, how they have informed our thinking even today.
And I think it's interesting bringing up what was lost and what was being rediscovered, because one of the lines that stood out to me from the book is that these maps were once famous and now forgotten. I'm wondering, how did you go about selecting which maps deserved to be remembered again, or just needed to find their time in the spotlight again from that once famous time?
Yeah, so I struggled. This was a real struggle for me because, because there's so many to choose from, but I wanted to construct a narrative for the book as well. So I didn't want it just to be, series of kind of standalone maps. I wanted to see how the history of cartography developed within the space that was there and the maps that we had. And so actually, it was astonishing to me really how coherent that history was, in terms of starting with the founders of UCL in the 1820s and how they created the most successful kind of atlas, subscription atlas that was created in the 1800s and sold millions of individual sheets of maps. How those guys then informed some of the scientific thinking, and some of the kind of slightly more, I suppose, reductive and less productive thinking around ethnographic mapping and so on, and the idea of nation building and etc. that developed at the end of the 1800s and then really kind of hit its stride during the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War. And then how those ideas of using maps to define countries suddenly kind of morphed even more into using maps to sell a kind of nationalist, racist agenda that happened throughout kind of 1930s Germany. And then at the end of the Second World War, how geography, but also cartography, as well, had to kind of reinvent itself to pivot away from the horrors that had come before, and to create a kind of a more optimistic view and rather about division. It became about connections and so on, and the kind of refocusing on scientific approaches. So, Marie Tharp's ocean floor maps. I mean, again, quite why we have, an almost complete set of Tharp's maps, in our room in Bloomsbury. No, not many other people in the UK even have access to these maps. It's extraordinary to me. And so we're able to kind of build that out. So I tried to, that narrative arc, that history emerged from the room, and then, I maybe had 5 examples of one particular idea. So I would then pick, what I thought was the most interesting of those 5. But this idea that you kind of have this, even these connections that you keep finding. So, the technique that Marie Tharp used to map the ocean floor was developed by someone called Lobeck, and he actually created that technique for the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War, so that he could help inform politicians about the terrain of the countries they were drawing these borders around. So it's an extraordinary thing where a development like that at the end of a war suddenly became something so much more impactful for science and for public communication at the 50, 60 years later, or I should say rather 40, 50 years later, when Marie Tharp and Bruce Heesin were sketching their ocean floor maps of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and so on. So there are many other examples like that, and that was the bit that was most fun for me, just seeing how all these people kind of inspired one another and progressed ideas around mapping and map making.
And what I find interesting with a lot of that progression is how we go from these beautifully crafted maps that have depictions of sea monsters, and like art was really a big part of them, of depicting the landscape or showing the dress of people that you would find when visiting somewhere. There's some of my favorite maps to look at, but we have those. We have more practical maps for like city navigation, or some more sinister, as we've talked about. Thinking about all of these different applications, what do they reveal about people and societies that made them?
Well, cartographers know that, or cartographers should know that, no map is perfect, and no map is kind of a truly kind of impartial depiction of the world, because the world is just too complex and too complicated to kind of reduce down, in its perfect form into a map. So you have to make a whole load of editorial decisions about what you're going to include and what you're going to exclude. And I think the way that different societies or different sort of different historical moments, people chose what went on a map, I think is really interesting. So at the beginnings of the 1800s, there was a clamor for science and for, it's a bit like today, really, understanding that there's loads of new data sets coming on stream, and we've got to work out how we might visualize and understand them. And so there are big questions about, well, how do you map something you can't see? So, for example, temperature. If you've never made a map of temperature before, how do you imagine how you map something like that? And it was actually von Humboldt and his collaborator Heinrich Berghaus who came up with this way of making maps of temperature using this thing called isolines, and those kind of helped dispel the myth that temperature varied kind of at a consistent rate from the equator to the poles. And so you had questions like, well, hang on, why is the temperature slightly warmer, in the North Atlantic? That could be because there's an ocean current there that's helping to transfer warmth closer to the poles. And so as soon as you start visualizing stuff, you can start to ask these extra questions, and that was really the imperative. And then those innovations then got distorted around kind of ethnographic mapping and understanding how you might use similar techniques to articulate a border for a country. And when you're arguing, what a country should look like, who gets what territory, then there's scope for cartographic innovation there to help make your argument. And there's this famous example of a map that was created for Hungary called the carte rouge, and because of the color red that was used to depict what was seen as the sort of Hungarian population there, and to create an argument for different borders, and then the idea that you can use maps to pursue kind of scientific endeavors, again later in the 20th century, I think became really important. And you had this really interesting moment where you've got the kind of beauty and complexity of the ocean floor maps that Tharp and Heesin and others were creating, using manual methods of just layering up sketches on tracing paper on light boards, and then simultaneously you've got someone like Tomlinson who's coding up the same kind of ideas, but he's doing it in a computer. But what he's producing is nothing like as complex and as beautiful as those maps. But of course, it has the potential to go on to be something much more, which is the digital cartography we see today. And so I think that there's really interesting moments like that where it reflects what people's priorities were, what their ambitions were, and actually what the kind of societal situation was at the time. And it's all shown in the way that these maps were created.
And I think hearing about that history and how things have changed and what are those considerations are always interesting. And there's always more maps to discover. Knowing how many you would have had to look at for the book, was there one map in particular that surprised you, something strange or striking or even oddly relevant to today's world?
I think it's very hard to pick one map actually, and I think it all just depends on I'm struggle with a good answer to this question, because I think depends what day it is and what my favorites are. Yeah. I think the maps I like best are the ones where someone has had to do something that hasn't been done before, and working through those challenges. And so I think there are a couple of examples. So one is this geological map of India, which didn't get the credit it deserved at the time, but it was created largely from correspondence. The guy that created it, he never visited India, but he just assimilated lots of data that people sent him. He then drew it out, and then actually the map itself was designed to be shared and feedback given on it. But unfortunately he died the year the book came out, so he didn't he wasn't he died the year the map came out, so he wasn't kind of able to sustain that process. The other map that I was kind of really inspired by was this map of Everest and the region around Everest that was created in the 1950s, and it's a astonishing kind of cartographic piece of work, and the physical endurance and effort that went into creating it, and the months spent in kind of extreme conditions to map it was astonishing to me. But also the fact that it was a pioneering example of photogrammetry as well. So it's one of the first maps they used kind of photography to map in detail, rather than having to do kind of this detailed triangulation that came before. So again, it kind of encapsulated the best of the artistry of kind of traditional cartography, but it had a kind of a new technology element to it mixed in as well.
Those are both interesting examples. The first one with the map of India for the geological map was done via distance, whereas Everest, so much of going to Everest is how remote it is, how hard it is. At that time would have been very difficult to ground truth any sort of that information. Whereas today, we have satellites, we have imagery, people want things immediately. We can see what happened somewhere within the past couple days, not long after. That's been a big shift digitally, and I'm wondering, how do you think digital mapping and GIS have changed our sense of geography and place compared to the eras where these lost maps were created?
It's an interesting question, and one I often reflect on, because I think there are different perspectives on this. So you could say, well, in historical examples, they mapped areas, but they probably were a little bit sparing with the truth sometimes if they hadn't quite been able to measure something or see something or whatever. They might well fill in the map regardless. And obviously there were certain definite kind of perspectives that were brought upon these maps that may not have reflected or included those groups of people who may well have been living in the areas that were being mapped, and so on. So there's that aspect, which nowadays the same could be said for the way that certain things like satellite imagery may be used, but actually we know that we've got a much richer data source, parts of the world that are inaccessible either through because of war or things like that, we can still access through satellite imagery, and we can actually see what's happening on the ground. So that's a real innovation. But this idea of the connection to the place that you're mapping, I think, is still a really important one, and it's something that can be easily forgotten, and it because people don't have to think twice now about what they're doing. So there's examples of maps where I think it's not in the book, but one of my favorite examples I use sometimes in my teaching is a kind of a dot density map of London's population. And so you have one dot representing whatever. You can in GIS you could make a dot density map of London, for one dot per person, or one dot representing 10 people, or whatever. And with that data set, you have your census areas, and so but you have to still randomly drop the dots within each of those areas. And if you do that, what happens is, because the census areas encapsulate industrial land uses, parks, all that kind of stuff, you end up scattering dots in areas where no one lives, and it looks a bit weird. But it only looks weird if you're from London and you understand the context. If you're unfamiliar with London, you may well think that people are living in these parks and so on. But there's a fantastic example of a dot density map from the early 1960s that we have that doesn't have that problem. And each dot is representing, 100 people in London. But because each one's been placed manually, the person doing it has obviously thought about, or had a moment to think about, the city, and so they place dots in areas where they know that there are people living, and so it doesn't have that problem. And of course, there are solutions to it. You can plumb in land use data. You can do lots of other things to kind of mitigate the challenges of the digital approach, but you have to have the presence of mind to do that, and you have to be proactive in thinking through these things. And so that's what I take away from a lot of these examples. It's understanding, kind of what the human aspect is. And I think the other thing I would say is, as a cartographer, actually, if a human being has created the map, oftentimes they are a bit more intuitive in the way that they handle things like generalization and omissions and so on and so forth. And again, if you're just pressing a button in the software to do that, it's not always the case that what you get out is as intuitive as it might be. So again, there's refinements you can do, but I think it's enabling people to, or at least encouraging. I encourage my students always to think about what they're mapping and how they might do it differently, or how they might counter some of these potential limitations from the kind of the much more automated approaches we're used to using.
I think looking at the tools and techniques as they've changed over time is what really becomes interesting, because there's been a wide range of techniques in the non-digital world when looking at map making that alone covers a range of what was being done 800 plus years ago, what was being done 300 years ago, 100 years ago. Now, in our digital space, what tools or techniques have most transformed how you work with geographic data in recent years?
I think, well, the two aspects for me. I think one is I'm not sure whether it's a tool or a technique, I guess, but it's the proliferation of data. So it's the idea that you
Mhm.
can just download, a data set. We earlier we discussed, the idea that satellite imagery can be downloaded, in near real time. I mean, that's really transformative in the way that you can. For example, one example, my favorite example of this from the book we did on where the animals go, was
Mhm.
developing base maps that actually matched the animals that we were mapping. So, if you're mapping snowy owls over the Great Lakes and how they're hunting, then actually you don't want a generic base map of the lakes in the summer um, to show where the owls are, because actually they're using ice rafts as platforms to do their hunting. So you really need the satellite image that shows where the ice rafts are, and how the owls are using them from the GPS data. And back in 2015, 2016, when we did that, that was still quite a innovative idea. Really, we forget how quickly this technology has developed in terms of its widespread availability. So I think that's one thing, just being able to access data. And then the second thing, I think, is just the computational
Mhm.
developments, particularly around GPUs and things like that, so that you're able just to kind of crunch through these huge volumes of data, really efficiently, in order to distill them down for the map that you're creating. And you know, um, I've been, I completed my PhD in 2011, and so 14 odd years ago, and over the course of that period, I mean, I almost feel guilty at how easy it is to do stuff now. I feel like if I'm not spending, if I'm not going away, leaving my computer sort of grinding overnight, I'm not doing
Mhm.
it properly. But of course, you can do in a few seconds what would have taken a few hours back then. So that's that for me are the best two developments, and particularly the speeding up of stuff. It means you can experiment, and it means you can play around with ideas much more often, and hopefully create something interesting at the end of it.
Mhm. And I think looking at how far we've come, even in the past 10, 15 years, gives you an appreciation for how did we do it then? What is easier now? Great, we're bringing in more AI tools and simpler workflows, things that can be done while we walk away. But that then makes me consider, when you're looking at maps from an everyday user perspective, whether it's Google Maps or in ArcGIS or another platform, how do you then develop that deeper appreciation for cartography when you've had to labor over analysis and base maps and things for days, weeks, however long, but now we can get them with the click of a button? Where does that deeper appreciation come from? How can we build it together?
It's an interesting question. I think for me, I don't actually think that. I think there's been some really interesting developments in the last decade or so around, the defaults for these
Mm-hmm.
things. So, ArcGIS, for example. I mean, cartographically, the kind of default options people are given, it's much more sophisticated. It's much better than it was, 10 years ago. And I think that enables people to pick up a map or pick up some data and drop it on a map, and it looks good. I actually think that we still have a long way to go in appreciating how hard it is to tell compelling stories
Mm-hmm.
with data, and having people invest the time and appreciate how much time it takes to do that well. And so the platforms exist. Story Maps is fantastic for these things, but you still have to do a lot of work to create something that's compelling and insightful, and that's often overlooked, I think. I mean, it's one, with my students, they go, they go on a real journey, because they always, it's a, really enjoy watching, how they have an idea, they think they can get there in an hour, and then suddenly they have this moment sort of 2 hours later that it's actually going to take way longer than they thought to kind of get the data they need and clean it and yada yada yada. And then they're kind of really, they hit rock bottom with the idea, and then suddenly it starts developing and building and building and building, and then you get to the end point that, they thought they were going to reach in an hour. It maybe takes them a couple of days. And what I say to them is, well, if you've done that well, then unfortunately no one's going to appreciate how much work went into it, because you've done a fantastic job, and it's instantly intuitive, it's instantly understandable for people, and so they don't understand, they won't appreciate how much work has gone into that. And that's okay. The whole point is that we're not asking users to do the work for us, we do it for them. But I think, there's still work to be done in educating users of GIS, but any kind of spatial analysis more generally, um, and helping them kind of create more compelling narratives from the maps that they're creating, to then really realize that impact of the power of the analysis that they've done.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great to hear that there is some challenge, that we're still seeing, that we're challenging people to think critically about the maps they're making, the data they're using. What is that process? It's not click a button and we're done. So there's still that part that's baked into what we're teaching people. It gives me a lot of appreciation, because I think even when I went through school about 10 years ago, when I was first discovering GIS and various things, there was still a process to it. And I'm glad that we don't have to sit overnight in the labs until 2 a.m. trying to figure something out. It's still an option. Don't get me wrong. If you want to be in the lab until 2 a.m., you can. But now we're able to do more things over time. It doesn't have to be a laborious process, because things have evolved. We've figured out ways that we don't have to code everything ourselves. We don't have to draw by hand anymore. We don't have to draw maps ourselves. So there's some of that that's come along. And I appreciate that insight. This brings us to our last question. I'm wondering, what's next for you after the Library of Lost Maps? Is it more books? Is it more maps? Is it more hunting through libraries for parts 2 through 50? Because I hear we've got more maps to explore. Where do we go from here?
Well, I don't yet have an answer to that question. I mean, I've got some exciting work I'm doing at the moment, which we should be, launching imminently around some data work that we've done in London and looking at some hard to reach populations and around people who work at night and night working in London. And there's some we're doing some great story maps and stuff around that actually. So and that's the first time I've kind of seriously embarked on creating a whole kind of series of story maps from some research. So I'm looking forward to seeing how they're received. The Library of Lost Maps, I'm under contract for a kind of a children's book version, so that will be quite a fun thing to work on, I think, to see what kind of kids are going to be excited about with that. And then I think I just need a little bit more time to kind of take a step back and think about whether the next steps are, more making maps or more writing about maps. I mean, it's interesting. I used to characterize people, or I still sort of characterize people as people who talk about maps, and then there are people who make maps. And there's not many people that do both of those things, particularly in geography departments. So I've kind of done both now, and so I'd like to kind of keep doing both if I can. But yeah, it's been intensely gratifying, but also extremely kind of tiring to kind of trawl through thousands of these maps and pull out these stories. So I'm kind of slightly in recovery mode from that. But yeah, I've learned so much, and that's the thing that I've just found so extraordinary about it. The history of cartography is something that I thought I knew a reasonable amount about, but I had no idea of the extent of my ignorance until I'd started kind of working on this book. So I'm hoping that people, there's some interesting surprises in there for people who are already kind of map obsessives, but there's some maps they won't have seen before and some stories that I don't think have been told before. So I'm hoping that there's something for everyone in there.
That's fantastic, and lots to look forward to. We'll include links for a lot of what we've discussed and some of what we just covered in our show notes, so make sure to check those out. Thank you again for joining us, James. It's been great having you on the podcast. And just like that, we're closing the pages on a few of history's forgotten maps, but thanks to James, they won't stay lost for long. From Cold War escapes to sea monster sightings, maps remind us that geography isn't just about where things are, it's about how we imagine the world around us. You can find the Library of Lost Maps wherever books are sold, and trust us, you'll want to get lost in it. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep thinking geographically.